With the disease series The Last of Us, where the cordyceps fungi infects humans and turns them into zombie, fungal infections have gained significant attraction over recent weeks. In this talk, I will focus on fungal infections and the real threat that is associated with them, and also changes in the fungal infection threat due to the climate change that we are currently observing. My name is Martin Hoenigl. I'm Associate Professor for Translational Mycology at the Medical University of Graz, Division of Infectious Diseases in Austria. Spending my first slide on the very successful blockbuster TV series The Last of Us, the question arises whether cordyceps may be a real threat to humans or whether this TV series is primarily fiction. We know from cordyceps that it can affect ants, and actually there is a really frightening video that you can watch on YouTube from BBC where you can see that cordyceps infects ants and infects their brains and makes them climb into high trees or leaves, and in order to further disseminate the fungal infection while they are dying and after they are dying. So this is definitely a fact. However, there's more than climate change necessary for cordyceps to become a threat to humans, as shown in this TV series, where humans get infected by the fungus and get directed by the fungus, turn into zombies, and finally become the fungus. But there is more change is necessary. So we are pretty far away from cordyceps becoming a huge threat from humans, and this is definitely fiction currently. However, it's a fact that fungi and fungal infections are an increasing threat to humans. And you can see here this quote from G.R. Thompson, one of the leading scientists and infectious disease specialists focusing on fungal infections, who says, "I think fungi are really becoming superbugs. I think they're really the ones that are going to be problematic over the next decade. The battle is sort of just beginning." And that's definitely a statement to which I agree. So it really seems that the fungi have emerged rapidly during the last century, becoming a threat in humans and causing morbidity and mortality in humans. And you can see here the increasing incidence rates of fungal infections over the last decades. Currently, we are dealing with an estimated 15 million cases of pulmonary and invasive fungal infections every year in our world. And the prevalence of invasive fungal infections particularly continues to increase in less immunocompromised patients. So fungi always find new patient groups in which they can cause disease and also mortality. We are living in a world where there's multiple times more fungal mass than human mass. And when disaster strikes, in the forms of natural disasters, for example, or viral pandemics, fungi are really there to strive and take control. And this is summarized in this editorial by myself in Lancet Respiratory Medicine, published last year. Moving further into the coronavirus pandemic, and you can see here the timeline of the pandemic starting in late 2019 and then extending over 2020 and 2021, it is very obvious that COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis started right with the viral pandemic and really occurred throughout the pandemic. And also other fungal infections like COVID-associated mucormycosis or candidiasis occurred during the pandemic in COVID-19 patients. Particularly COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis has become a big threat during COVID-19, occurring with a median incidence of 11 to 15% in patients with severe COVID-19 admitted to the ICU. So 1 out of 10 to 1 out of 7 patients in the ICU with COVID-19 developed this COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis. And in fact, this fungal superinfection was a strong independent risk factor for mortality, with mortality rates of kappa or COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis of well above 50%. And that you can see also here in this study, where it's really that the survival curves in red are the survival curves in those with kappa, versus in black the survival curves in those only with severe COVID that are otherwise matched. And you can see here how much kappa really increases mortality in COVID-19 patients. The problem with Aspergillus and many of these other opportunistic pathogens, fungal pathogens like also Candida, is that they occur worldwide. And that's what you can also see in this map. There seems to be more cases in Europe, but this is really only due to the fact that the COVID wave hit first very strong in Europe. That's why the first reports came from there. But it really occurs around the world. However, there's not only aspergillosis, there's also another mold infection, mucormycosis, an opportunistic fungal infection that usually occurs in patients with cancer, with hematological malignancy, or also with solid cancer, and uncontrolled diabetes as a main risk factor. Outbreaks have been associated with contaminated hospital products. For example, there have been outbreaks associated with contaminated bed sheets, also wooden spatula described from the US. And also, of course, war injuries are a major predisposing factor with 37 cases in American soldiers in 2009-2010 occurring. However, when mucormycosis really got the attention of the world, it was during COVID-19, where it was caught a causative pathogen of the black fungus pandemic that went viral in media around the world, particularly causing large numbers of cases and also fatalities in India. So what contributed to this black fungus pandemic caused by Mucorales? First of all, it's the environmental factors that are ubiquitous in India with exposure during farming activities, but also due to the central air conditioning system that's used in India. However, this is not only true for India, it's also true for many other countries, including, for example, China, or also Egypt, Pakistan, Iran. Many other countries do have a lot of environmental exposure. What really changed during COVID was the number of people, of humans that were susceptible to develop mucormycosis. And the black fungus pandemic did not hit India early on during the COVID pandemic. It really came a little bit later during the Delta wave of COVID. At that time, there were more non-diagnosed people with diabetes. So undiagnosed diabetes was a problem there because even early during the pandemic, routine healthcare services were reduced in India. At the same time, people with known diabetes were more likely uncontrolled also because of the routine healthcare services being turned down. And then, of course, the Delta wave hit India really hard. So at that time point, India did not have enough oxygen supplies to really deal with this devastating Delta wave, similar to many other countries of the world. But what was different in India was that dexamethasone, a corticosteroid immunosuppressive drug to treat severe COVID-19, was available for everyone to buy without a prescription over the counter. So the lack of oxygen with like this easy availability of corticosteroids really contributed as well to this black fungus wave that really shocked the world. And the implications of these factors in terms of mucormycosis epidemiology are displayed in this slide and in this study by Atul Patel, where you can clearly see that the number of cases or the prevalence rates of mucormycosis during COVID-19 in India was doubled to what we were observing before. However, there may be arguments that what we have seen in India with the hundreds, thousands of cases during COVID-19 of mucormycosis may only be the tip of the iceberg. Because the problem with mucormycosis is that there is different clinical manifestations. There is the reno-orbital cerebral form of mucormycosis infecting the renal cavities and then going into the orbiter and then in the brain, which is relatively easy to diagnose clinically without a lot of extensive microbiological tests or invasive procedures necessary. However, we know from countries like the US or even in Europe or many other countries around the world that about 50% of mucormycosis cases are in fact pulmonary mucormycosis cases or even gastrointestinal or disseminated mucormycosis cases, which are much harder to diagnose and really require invasive procedures and aggressive diagnostics to diagnose them. However, and that's really not coming from me, but from colleagues from India, in most hospital settings in India, it won't be possible to even diagnose these forms of mucormycosis. That really indicates that maybe the actual burden of mucormycosis in India during COVID was much higher than reported by government and in the media. We've talked now a lot about fungal pathogens that may be opportunistic pathogens as they infect patients or people who are already immunocompromised or have uncontrolled diabetes or other risk factors. However, this is not the whole story. We also do deal with pathogens currently that may infect everyone. Like here, Acapulco, Mexico, spring break 2001. More than 200 American college students developed pulmonary symptoms after spring break. And then CDC came into action and they found out basically that all these 200 American college students returning to the US were staying at the same hotel in Acapulco. And the risk factor when interrogating these students was that they frequently used the staircases instead of using the lifts, the elevators. So CDC traveled down to Acapulco and took samples, and what they found basically is that the potting soil in a plant in the staircase was contaminated with histoplasmosis, with Histoplasma capsulatum. And just passing by this plant was enough to get 200 healthy American college students infected and sick. And when looking on the world map of histoplasmosis here, you can see clearly that the histoplasmosis is occurring in many places around the world, particularly in warmer places. But as the world becomes warmer, there are now spots that it occurs, for example, also in Europe, in Southern Europe, where it didn't occur like a decade ago. So histoplasmosis is definitely spreading around the world and threatening us humans. We may not die from it. Many of us who are immunocompetent may not die from it, but it is enough to make us sick for a week or two. So now the question arises, why are fungal infections not yet posing an even bigger threat to humans? We know that fungi are ubiquitous in nature and they are found on and also in our bodies as constituents of the human microbiome. So we all have this microbiome, this fungi in our lungs, on our skin, for example, and in our gut, of course. Nevertheless, of the estimated 5.1 million different species of fungi in the world, only around 300 can currently cause disease regularly in humans. And the reason really is our high body temperature and the fact that we constantly need to eat in order to keep our high body temperature. And fungi do in fact not grow well at our high body temperature. And also, of course, our healthy immune system is usually well adapted in dealing with those that can do. However, what if our body temperature would be colder? How would we see fungi then? And this is best described by fungal infection outbreaks occurring in some groups of animals. For example, here, Pseudogymnastus destructans, a fungal pathogen that causes the white nose syndrome in bats in North America. And this fungus was responsible to the death of more than 6 million bats in North America. And in some caves, over 90% of all bats are now extinct due to this fungus. Luckily for us humans, these fungal spores survive at temperatures of 0 to 20 degrees and can't survive currently at our 37 degrees or 36 degrees human temperature. Another example from the animals. Mycology is a fungal disease that affects amphibians worldwide. It's caused by the chytrid fungus, which is really capable of causing sporadic death in some amphibian populations at nearly 100% mortality rates. This disease has really been implicated in mass die-offs and species extinctions of frogs since the 1990s. Luckily for us, also the chytrid fungal spores can only grow at temperatures between 17 and 25 degrees and not yet at human temperatures. However, could it be possible that this may change in the near future due to global warming? While it's not likely that such a temperature rise from 25 degrees, like with the chytrid fungus, to 37 degrees will occur rapidly, there are indications that with global warming and climate change, important mechanisms change in terms of fungi becoming pathogens for humans. First of all, climate change has been associated with increased virulence in fungal pathogens. It also has been associated with increased geographic ranges of endemic fungal pathogens that were restrained until now to certain geographic regions. Also, climate change has been associated with natural disasters, resulting in increased dispersal of fungal pathogens and spores, increasing host susceptibility, and also leading to trauma and wounds in humans that make them more susceptible for fungal infections. One important example of an endemic mycosis that may pose a bigger threat to humans in the future is coccidioidomycosis. When we look into the map where coccidioidomycosis or the valley fever is occurring now, we see that it's occurring in most of South and Western United States. However, 20 years ago, it would have been depicted mostly in Arizona and Nevada, while really now it already has spread rapidly across the United States. In terms of biology and way of infection, this is really a fungal infection that can occur in anyone, not only the immunocompromised. It gets inhaled, causes primary lung infection, and really most people don't get ill or only get ill for a little bit, for a few weeks, while others may develop severe infection up to meningitis. And the problem with coccidioidomycosis is once it causes meningitis, this is probably not curable. So this means coccimeningitis means lifelong therapy with antifungals and high morbidity and mortality. In fact, coccidioidomycosis already poses a big problem and is the most important fungal infection in, for example, Southern California. However, when now thinking about global warming and that the world will continue to get warmer, there are maps and calculations and models that clearly show that coccidioidomycosis will spread further across the US. And within 20, 50, 90 years, it will really be spread across most of the United States and also, of course, neighboring countries. So coccidioidomycosis is definitely a disease that will cause bigger problems over the next decades. Also, histoplasmosis, I showed you the map before, originally confined to the Americas and to Africa, now also occurring in Southern Europe, also increasingly occurring in Asia. So definitely here also climate change that plays a role and leads to spread of this endemic fungal infection. Another problem that comes along with climate change is the increased number of natural disasters. Floods, storms, hurricanes, also earthquakes can really lead to dispersal and aerosolation of fungal spores and implant them into humans via traumatic wounds that humans suffered due to these natural disasters. And thereby they can result in infections by previously very rare or unknown fungal species. Also, wildfires are an increasing problem in many parts of the world. And these wildfires have been shown that they produce basically clouds of dust and of smoke. But these clouds also contain a high number of fungal spores. And what we have observed in Southern California, that whenever there was wildfire season, you could smell the fire in the city, although the fire was much further inland. But you also had more severe fungal infections in your hospitals. And we really think that these fungal spores are dispersed via the clouds after wildfire coming into urban areas. There's a number of examples of outbreaks of fungal outbreaks and also, for example, of mucormycosis outbreaks occurring after natural disasters or tsunamis, for example, also after the Joplin tornado in Missouri, United States. So summarizing, natural disasters lead to an increase in dispersal of fungal spores, host susceptibility, and trauma and wounds, really resulting in an increase of fungal infections. Important to note, and these are really examples that come from fungal plant pathogens, is that climate change may also have an impact on the virulence of certain fungi. In Fusarium graminearum, it has been shown that with climate change, the production of mycotoxins increases, and not only the high temperature, but also water stress may contribute to this increase of mycotoxins, which makes this a much more potent disease-causing fungal species. And there's also another example from Buccinium striiformis, which really has adapted to higher temperatures, but now has strains that are more aggressive and thermotolerant, that are replacing the old strains and spread to new regions. Most strikingly, climate change and global warming may result in non-human pathogens becoming human pathogens. And the most prominent example for this is Candida auris. Candida auris was originally a plant pathogen, really existing in the wetlands back then in India, causing disease in plants. But then basically it became thermotolerant, adapted to higher temperature, was transported via birds into rural environments, and from there it was transported into urban environments and hospitals. And now we are facing the situation that Candida auris is a very relevant pathogen, causing infectious disease and Candida outbreaks in our intensive care units. Because first it comes with high number of fungal resistance, so our antifungals are often not active against Candida auris, and also, and maybe even more importantly, it's transmissible from humans via personnel and staff in the ICU to other humans in the ICU, causing these large outbreaks. And just to emphasize and show you how quick this epidemiology may be changing, this is a map of Candida auris outbreaks up to 2017. You see that there's a few outbreaks around the world that had occurred during the last few years around the world. But please compare this with the map that we have in 2021. You see many more outbreaks, many more countries affected, and it's pretty safe to say that, a few years more, and we will have Candida auris around the world in pretty much every country. This brings me to my take-home messages. Climate change will likely result in a further increase of fungal infection prevalence. The world becomes warmer, and this alters the attributes of the fungus and may increase virulence and may prefer certain highly virulent strains. It may also infect the host and increase host susceptibility, for example, due to natural disasters. And most importantly, of course, it may also impact the host environment and by, for example, the geographic range. Due to the fact that the world becomes warmer, endemic fungal pathogens may spread to areas where they have not existed before. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention.